Well, hey, we just wanted to say thank you for tuning in and watching these teachings. Wherever you're coming from, however you listen, we consider it a real privilege to bring the Word of God to you. And it's been a while for our church since we've been in one of the Gospels. And so this season, we're going to be studying through Mark together because we just feel led to look at the Gospels, learn from Jesus, and be his disciples. So let's go to the teaching together. Mark chapter 8, and we're going to pick up the story in verse 11. Just before we jump in, I want to remind you about the structure of Mark, because in this gospel, there's a very clear way that Mark has structured the story of Jesus. And as was drilled into my brain this past year in seminary, structure is the key to meaning. So when you see how the authors wrote what they wrote and how they chose what to put in and what to leave out and how they even arranged and organized the story, it's because they're painting a very purposeful picture. And so it's really simple, but just think of Mark this way as two acts, like a play with two acts. The first act is, who is Jesus? That's what's been going on in Mark chapter 1 up until this point in Mark chapter 8. Mark tells us, the reader, in the first sentence of the gospel, but as the story unfolds and as we come down to sort of the ground level of everyone else's experience interacting with Jesus, everyone's just kind of scratching their heads, trying to figure out, who is this? And in fact, that question's asked over and over on the pages of Mark. So that's Act 1, who is Jesus? And then Act 2 is, how does Jesus become king? Because Mark also tells us that in the first sentence of the gospel, that this is the story, the good news about Jesus, the anointed king. And so as you're watching Jesus, you're realizing up to this point, he doesn't look like a king, does he? He's not in a palace, he's not on a throne, and yet his message is about the kingdom of God that's breaking in. And so we're going to come to understand by the end of Mark's gospel just what kind of king Jesus is and how he becomes king. And it's in a very unusual way. It's not like the kingdoms of this world or the kingdoms of men. And that's why Mark is telling this story. But right here in the middle, Mark is 16 chapters. So right here at chapter 8 is this pivotal moment in the story that Mark has placed here for a purpose. What happens in Mark chapter 8 is very significant, because what we find is there's still quite a bit of confusion about the first question. What was the first question? Who is Jesus? There's all kinds of theories. There's all kinds of ideas. Just like today, if you ask people who is Jesus, there's all kinds of ideas. And that was going on even when Jesus was walking on the earth, interacting with people in the flesh. There's still quite a bit of confusion about the first question. And here now, as Jesus starts to reveal his path to the throne, what kind of king he is and how it is that he becomes king, there's not only going to be confusion, there's going to be outright bewilderment and rejection from his closest followers. Because as Jesus talks about going to Jerusalem, which is the political capital, if you would, of this part of the world, that's where all the power players were focused and centered and headquarters. And as Jesus talks about going to Jerusalem, He doesn't, and this is what we're going to see today, he doesn't start talking about assembling weapons and armies. That's how most people become king, right? If there's someone ruling, if there's someone in power, then we raise an army, we gather our weapons, and we go take them out and we go take over. But if you know the story of Jesus, that's not how he becomes king. He starts talking, as we'll see, not about weapons and armies, but about crosses and suffering. And he doesn't reveal a plan to take the lives of his enemies, but instead starts talking about how he's going to lay down his life for his enemies. And so let's dig into this together. If what Jesus is saying and doing as we read through this seems surprising, I just want to remind you that's a good thing because it makes us wonder. And wonder is part of worship. Wonder leads to worship. Aren't you glad today that we don't worship a predictable God? Aren't you glad today that we're not praising a God who always acts in expected ways, who can't be, if you would, kept in a box? I'm praying that today as we open Mark's gospel, that we'll see and hear him today and that it would cause us and lead us to worship. So just a warning, we're going to try to cover quite a bit of ground because it's really beautiful how Mark puts this all together, and I hope that you can see it. So let's start in verse 11. And we'll kind of break this up and explain along the way. The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now, if you've been reading through Mark with us, I'm guessing that, like me, you think that's a strange way to respond. When they ask for a sign, Jesus is like, "Why are you asking for signs? No sign will be given to you." Hasn't he been doing signs this whole time? So it should make us stop and think, why is Jesus responding this way to the request of the Pharisees? He's just finished, and Wes did such a great job teaching on this last week, feeding the 4,000. Wasn't that a sign? So what's Jesus' response all about? Here's what I want you to consider. I think that Jesus responds in this way because by now they've seen plenty of signs. They've heard about all kinds of signs, and yet essentially their request for a sign is, "We're looking for a certain kind of sign, Jesus. That's great that you've done all that. That's wonderful that you've healed people and forgiven people and raised dead people and delivered people from demons. That's all great, but show us a sign." And what's behind that request, I think, is that they're looking for a certain kind of sign that would fulfill their expectations of what Messiah should do. So if you're really the king, Jesus, if you're really the anointed one that's going to deliver us, show us how you plan on destroying your enemies. Because that's really what we're interested in, right? I mean, the Romans are here. They're oppressing us. We're surrounded by pagans. We're wondering, Jesus, if you're the Messiah, when do we get to hear about your plans to take over? When do we get to hear about your plans to destroy our enemies? In other words, their request, if we were to paraphrase, it might be like this: Jesus, can you show us a sign about what ultimately you're planning on doing? Otherwise, stop wasting our time. Which is just amazing to think that that would be their response in the face of the miracles that they've seen and heard about. But Jesus responds to them by saying, "No sign. I'm not going to give you that kind of sign. That's not the kind of king that I am. That's not the kind of kingdom that I'm bringing. So if that's what you're expecting, you're not going to see any sign like that." And so then the story moves on because in verse 14, they get in the boat. They'd forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them. And so Jesus cautions them in verse 15, "Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, do you not understand? I love this. Jesus is frustrated with his followers. And he uses the language that has already appeared in Mark to describe his frustration with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders. Do you remember back in Mark chapter 4, when Jesus was explaining the secrets of the kingdom, he quotes from Isaiah 9, and he talks about seeing they don't perceive and hearing they don't hear or understand. And all of those words, seeing, hearing, perceiving, understanding, are what he's now saying to his own disciples. He even says, are your hearts hardened? Which was also his accusation against the Pharisees in the synagogue one day when they brought a man with a withered hand, just seeing what Jesus would do on the Sabbath. They didn't care about the man with the withered hand. They were trying to trap him in a religious debate, and Jesus is grieved by the hardness of their hearts. Now he says those same kinds of words to his own disciples. It's as if Jesus is saying, you guys are in real danger of being like the Pharisees and the followers of Herod. What does that mean? What were the Pharisees and the followers of Herod characterized by? Hardness of heart. A failure to understand what Jesus is saying and doing. But don't misunderstand the moment. Don't misunderstand his frustration, because a lot of times when I say, or we talk about a misunderstanding or a failure to understand, we might think, oh, well, they just don't have enough information. Or maybe they just have some sort of intellectual deficiency. They just aren't smart enough to grasp what Jesus is saying. It's none of that. This is a failure to understand that's not an intellectual limitation or a lack of information. It's a failure to understand that's due to the hardness of heart. And Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, by now, you guys have been given every advantage. You've been given every opportunity. And this is sort of the interaction in the boat. Jesus says something to them on a spiritual level: beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians, the followers of Herod. And it's almost like the disciples just completely ignore what he said. They just start arguing or talking about the fact, Jesus says, hey, guys, listen, I want you to be really careful about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. And they're like, okay, hey, did you bring bread? Because I'm hungry. My stomach's rumbling. Do you have bread? And Jesus is like, why are you talking about bread? Like, well, we forgot bread. And he's like, well, let's go over this. How many baskets of bread did you have when there was just 3? Like, am I unable to provide bread if you need bread? Hasn't that been demonstrated already? And yet, when I say something to you, you don't pay any attention to it. Instead, you're worried about bread, physical things, temporary things. And so Jesus has some stern words for his disciples, a real warning, because he's seeing that their hearts are in danger of becoming hardened. Again, it's not because they don't have enough information. It's not because there's some kind of intellectual limitation. This failure to understand, you could think of it this way: it's a refusal to understand. Why would they refuse to understand? Simply, I think because they refuse to let go of seeing things their own way. They still have this expectation of where this is leading and where this is going. They still, if you would, they have an agenda in their mind that eventually Jesus, like the Pharisees, he's going to stop messing around and get on board with some things that are really important that we need to take care of. And because of their refusal to let go of their focus on that, they can't see what Jesus is trying to draw their attention to. And that's, I don't know if you know this, that's a real danger for me and you too. That Jesus is Lord, And when he speaks to his people, that's what we should pay attention to. That's what we should be focused on. But how often are we like the disciples, where God speaks to us and it's like, yeah, anyways, but I have this need over here that I'm worried about. And I think one of the things that as followers of Jesus we see in this story is the need to learn that much of our lack of understanding is not, again, due to a lack of information. It's due to a hard heart. It's due to a commitment and a loyalty to our own way, our own agenda, our own things. And so they're in real danger. Jesus is warning them. But then this happens in verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to Jesus a blind man and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes, laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." So Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." So everything in this story is very familiar so far in Mark's gospel, except what? The healing doesn't take fully the first time. And so this is really interesting, because I don't know about you, that grabs my attention. As I'm reading, my first question is, why is this sandwiched right in the middle of this story? But I think that detail stops us in our tracks. What happened? Why does Jesus have to touch this man twice? Why didn't the healing work the first time like every other time? And I think that what we're going to find is that this man's healing becomes a sort of object lesson for the disciples themselves in the condition that they're in. Because when Jesus touches him the first time, he sort of sees, but it's not clear. He's not seeing correctly. He's not seeing fully. And so Jesus touches him again, which is almost exactly what happens next with Peter. And Mark just moves on immediately. Watch this, verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" That's the question, right? The first act of Mark's gospel. Now Jesus himself, this far in, poses the question, who do people think that I am? Verse 28, they told him John the Baptist, others said Elijah, others one of the prophets. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So this looks really promising, right? Peter's got it. He sees, right? He sees what Mark told us in the first sentence. This is the moment when Jesus asks the very important question. It's interesting to talk today about who other people think Jesus is, but did you know the most important question today is, who do you say that he is? Who do you say? And Peter steps forward to the question and says, "I know who you are. You're the anointed one. You're the anointed king." That's what Christ means. I think we need to keep being reminded that Christ isn't Jesus' last name. It's a title. Anointed king. Whenever you see that word, anointed king, Peter says, "I know who you are. You're the anointed king." And Jesus is like, "Good. Don't tell anyone." We're kind of used to that in Mark 2, right? He's healing people. Don't tell anyone. But then watch what happens next, because we're all excited. This moment is full of possibility. Peter seems to be seeing, but watch verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now I want you to notice a couple of words that are really key in those sentences. The Son of Man must, we circle that word or underline it or highlight it or just pay attention to it, must. And then before that, it says that in verse 31, he began to teach them. This is a teaching. This isn't Jesus just informing them like, hey, there's some stuff that's going to happen. I mean, I don't really want it to happen, but it's going to happen, and I just need you to know that. What does he say? He starts teaching them that this must happen. That this is part of God's plan, this suffering that he's speaking about, that he must endure, that he must go through. He teaches them that this is part of God's perfect plan, which blows our minds as much as it did theirs. Because he tells them, hey, I'm going to be killed, after 3 days rise again. And he said this, don't you love this, verse 32, plainly. It wasn't in metaphors or poems. He just said what it says here. I'm going to be killed. And then in 3 days, I'm going to rise again. We have the benefit on this side of the story of knowing exactly what that means. They're going, what in the world are you talking about? So Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. You have to just love this moment. Because the sentence before, Peter's like, you're the anointed king. The next sentence, he's like, come here. Come here, anointed king. I'm going to tell you what's up. I'm going to tell you what's wrong with your plan. But don't we love this because we relate to Peter? We have our moments where we're surrendered and acknowledging, Jesus, you're the king. And then the next moment we're like, no, I'm going with my plan. I'll tell you what's going to happen. And so Peter rebukes Jesus, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And doesn't that take us right back to where we began in the boat when Jesus said, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. That's the things of God. But they weren't setting their mind on the things of God. What were they setting their mind on? Bread. The things of men. And here's Peter doing it again. What are the things of God? Teaching them how the Son of Man must suffer and be killed and rise in 3 days. Those are the things of God. What are the things of man? No, we don't accept that. We don't accept suffering as a part of God's plan. We expect and accept dominance, victory. Peter can't wrap his mind around. So what's happening? Peter's like the blind man. And he represents all of the disciples. That the best that they can see is fuzzy at best. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? You're the Christ. Is he seeing? Sort of. Because when Jesus describes what the anointed king, how he comes into his kingdom, it's fuzzy. And this is the point. This is what I want us to see today as we look at this text together. What point does Peter fall off? He's going along, it's good, it's good, it's good. When does it fall off a cliff? At the suffering part, right? It's all good until crosses and suffering come up. And then it's like, no. We're not on board with that, Jesus. And keep in mind, this isn't a metaphorical cross, right? That's unfortunately what we do today because people aren't crucified on the side of the road like they were then, where you would have seen this, no doubt in your lifetime. You would have seen the oppression, the violence, and the torture of the Romans that were ruling over this place. Man, there would be a vivid image in your mind that wasn't a metaphor. Today, we talk about crosses like, I have allergies and it's just my cross to bear. That's not the cross that Jesus was talking about. This is a literal, scandalous, unimaginable thing that Jesus would say, hey, I'm going to a Roman cross. And this is how I plan on entering into the glory of my kingdom. Church, as much as we know that story, I think it's still completely unfathomable for us to grasp today. that the way to enter into the glory of God's kingdom is through suffering. And we know this because when Jesus talks about crosses and suffering, it's not just his own. Look at what finishes Mark chapter 8 into chapter 9, verse 34. Calling the crowd to him with his disciples after he rebukes Peter, he said, if anyone would come after me, anyone that wants to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his what? Not allergies. Cross. Instrument of brutal torture and suffering. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he said to them, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. That's the part we want. Bring the kingdom with power, Jesus. What does he say? If you're going to follow me, it's through the cross. It's through taking up your cross, denying yourself, and losing your life. In other words, Jesus is saying you have to understand that anyone who follows me will experience their share of the suffering that I endured. There will be a cross to bear, and there will be sacrifices to make if we will remain loyal to Jesus. So how do we kind of try our best to appreciate the shift that this represents for those first disciples? Why are they just not getting it? Why can't they see it? And I think it's the same reason for us today, why it's so hard to see. That the way of Jesus is not seize control, kill your enemies, and take power. The way of Jesus is serve and walk in loyalty to God and be willing to make every sacrifice for the sake of the mission. I think the way that we can appreciate the shift that this represents for these disciples is, we could say it this way, they've seen the glory of his majesty, his authority. Remember how much that comes up early in Mark? Jesus would do a miracle, and what are people asking? Where did he get the authority to do that? Jesus would give a teaching, and they'd say, how does he teach with such authority? Jesus would cast out a demon. They'd say, where does he get that authority? Jesus would forgive a man's sins, and they would say, hey, only God has that authority. The whole question in the first half of Mark is of his authority because they're seeing the glory of his majesty. But now Jesus is going to begin to reveal the glory of his suffering. And this is where they're tempted to step back and say, nope, not on board with that. The glory of his majesty? Yeah, let's keep healing, forgiving. Let's keep calming storms and, feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread. The glory of his majesty we're all about. But as he begins to teach them about the glory of his suffering, they suddenly become unsure. And yet Jesus wants them to understand the nature of the call to follow him. Do you understand this about following Jesus? That we are called to experience not only the glory of his majesty, but the glory of his suffering. That there is no crown of glory in this story without a crown of thorns. There is no throne or kingdom without the cross. And there is no salvation, no deliverance. There is no accomplishing the mission that Jesus came to accomplish apart from great sacrifice. And so what Jesus is doing is inviting his disciples, come. I've invited you in the first part of the gospel to share in the glory of my majesty. You've got to participate in the miracles. You've gotten to hear the teachings. It's been revealed to you the secrets of the kingdom. Now, come share with me in the glory of suffering. And they hesitate. We're not sure about that, Jesus. And I think we're equally unsure today, aren't we? How often are we tempted in our suffering to really question the plans of God? Because this persistent idea that if we're walking with God, if we're following Jesus, it's just this upward arc from, majestic comfort to glorious power. And Jesus is trying to get across to his people, this is not the way. This is not what you'll experience when you follow me. And I think this is exactly the place that we can begin to apply this story to our own lives, because this invitation to enter in and share in the glory of Jesus through suffering is open to everyone here today. But let's be clear, it's not suffering on purpose. It's not, hey, let's go do things that cause us to suffer for no reason. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about when you follow me, when you're loyal in your commitment to me, you will experience suffering. And when that happens, don't freak out. Don't doubt or abandon the mission. Understand that this is a part of the path that leads to glory. And Jesus, as he teaches his disciples this, then turns and says, follow me. And my question, church, for us is how willing are we to hear this teaching and this invitation from Jesus and follow him in the path of suffering for the sake of the mission? See, the amazing thing is, like I said, we don't have to suffer on purpose, do we? We don't have to add suffering to our lives. I'm pretty sure that you would agree with me. Everyone suffers to some degree. I think one of the worst things that we can do is try to compare our suffering with the suffering of other people. Pain is personal. There's no point in doing that. But here's what we can all say today. Every one of us has experienced suffering in this life. And I think what Jesus is saying, if our hearts can be open to it, if we'll let go of our agendas enough to hear his invitation, I think there's a real encouragement here for all of us, because we all do experience suffering. And what Jesus is saying is, it's not meaningless, it's not wasted, it's not pointless. God is able to bring a redemptive purpose. And I want to quickly add, when I say that, I don't believe that all of our suffering is the plan of God. There's a view in theology, the meticulous view of every detailed thing is decreed by God. I think there is suffering that is not the plan or the purpose of God, and yet God is able, like Paul says in Romans 8, to work in all things for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. But can we get a little bit more specific? I want to get a little bit more specific, and then we'll end. Because I think there's categories when we talk about suffering, when we talk about this call to follow and enter into the glory of his suffering, we realize today, right, that there's categories when we consider our suffering and why we suffer. The first would be suffering because of our own sinful decisions. There's no glory in that. When we suffer because of our own willful rejection of God's way, here's what the Bible says. It addresses that. Bear it patiently. And I guess the glory would be that God meets us with his grace, even when we rebel against him. So there's the suffering that comes from our own sinful decisions. There's the suffering that comes from the sinful decisions of others. We've all experienced suffering in this life because of choices and things that other people have done. There's the suffering that comes from our own sinful responses to the sinful choices of others. See, we love to focus on number two. We love to attribute the vast majority of our suffering to things that other people do. Did you know that's not the majority of where your suffering comes from? It isn't. It's not to minimize that that's not a reality. But here's the truth. Our own sinful choices, along with our own sinful responses to the sinful choices of others, creates the vast majority of our suffering. And then there's a fourth category, the suffering that comes from just living in a fallen world. A world that is in rebellion against God until he comes and makes all things new. But did you know that in those four categories, our own sinful choices, the sinful choices of others, our own sinful responses to other people's sinful choices, and living in a fallen world, did you know that all of that suffering, if you add it all up, it still is not yet even talking about what Jesus is talking about here? Because he's talking about, guess what, as a Christian, you get a fifth bonus category of suffering. Because everyone in the world experiences those first four. Guess what followers of Jesus, faithful, loyal followers of Jesus, get to experience in addition? More suffering. Suffering that is specifically for the sake of living loyal to the way of Jesus. And that's a real thing. Some of you have experienced that to one degree or another. So here's Jesus' invitation in Mark chapter 8. Will you follow me? And to those that would say yes, are you willing to be so genuinely, deeply committed to the mission that you will make great sacrifices to see it accomplished? What's the mission? That all would come to repentance. That the world would change their mind about who Jesus is and turn from their rebellion to trust and love. And that every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of God the Father. That's the mission. And so the question that we're confronted with, like these disciples, what am I willing to forego for the sake of the mission? What am I willing to suffer for the sake of the mission, the calling? To participate in the work of Jesus, to see lives changed and transformed and rescued from darkness and freed from bondage. What am I willing to sacrifice to be a part of the work that God is doing? And what I find in myself too often, church, and maybe you're like me, is I'm all on board for sharing in the glory of his majesty. But I tend to fall off right where Peter fell off. I don't get the glory of your suffering, Lord. I don't get why it has to be that way. But it is, and it does. And this is his call to us. And the message of hope that I want to leave with you today as we prepare to come to the table and take communion together, church. These emblems of his suffering, his body broken, his blood shed. The message of hope that I want to leave with you today is that the glory of Jesus' suffering is that the cross has the power to transform our perspective on all our suffering. Again, you take those categories. My own sinful decisions. And this is what they couldn't understand in Mark 8, but you know what? They're going to understand on the other side of the cross. Once they see it, and that's the benefit that we have. We're on the other side. We see it. But the question is, having eyes, do we see? Having ears, do we hear? Do we perceive and understand the glory of his suffering? Because when it comes to my own sinful decisions, when I'm suffering because of the poor choices that I've made, how does the cross transform that suffering? It reminds me of his grace. He bore my sin. He was willing to take my sin and show grace to me, the sinner. What about the sinful decisions of other people? How does the cross transform that? Those are the moments when I'm suffering because of the choices of other people where I really get to enter into the fellowship of his suffering. He suffered for the sake of other people and showed mercy and forgiveness. The cross transforms all our suffering. What about my own sinful responses to other people's sinful decisions? When I come to the cross, how could I not humble myself and say, Jesus, when they crucified you, good decision, bad decision. Bad decision to crucify the Son of God, the perfect, spotless Lamb. When they reviled him and spit on him, did he spit back? Did he revile back? Or did he not say, Father, forgive them? They don't know what they're doing. When they pierced him and crucified him, did not a heart of love and forgiveness and mercy flow from him? Church, the cross has the power to transform all our suffering. What about the fact that we live in a sinful, fallen world? And that we have to deal with things like cancer and disease and sickness and weakness. Does not the cross transform our suffering with hope? That even as Jesus suffered and died and rose again to new life, so will you be raised in new life. Paul said it this way, this light and momentary affliction is not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed. The cross transforms our suffering. And when we, on the rare occasions that I think people like you and me do, when we suffer for loyal living to the way of Jesus, what does the cross show us? It's worth it. That's where the crown is. He wore the crown of thorns, and now he wears the crown of glory. And so will we, if, like Jesus says in Mark 8, we're not ashamed of him. And as we come to the table today, church, this is our way of saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the good news that Jesus didn't conquer with the sword, but he suffered on the cross to lay down his life for his enemies, which I once was. We had no chance if this wasn't the way. We had no chance to be saved. But because this is the way that he enters into his kingdom, because this is the crown that he wears, you and I can come after him and come in, and he welcomes us to sit at his table, sinners like you and me. He says, come and eat and drink and dine with me. You're welcome here. That's the invitation. And so my prayer is that you would allow, through this perspective at the table, the cross before us this morning, the blood and broken body of Jesus, that you would allow it to transform your suffering into glory. That's what he does. That's who he is. Well, what a gift the Gospels are as we get to look into the life of Jesus and see God dwelling among us, real flesh and blood, a human being just like us. And I hope that these teachings will inspire you and us to really pray and think through as we learn from Jesus what it looks like to be his disciples in everyday life. And so wherever you're watching, we're in this together. That's our goal, is to be fully formed and to become more like him. So thanks for watching.